Hello, friends. Welcome back to Currently Workshopping, a show where we work through the perils and frisson of being alive together. This week, I'm going to be talking about my publishing journey and answer some questions from all of y'all about getting a book published with a traditional publisher, as opposed to self-publishing. And this is really for first-time authors because if you've been through the process once before, you probably already know what the rodeo is like. I also can't believe that we only have that's right, 3 episodes left this season. So if you've been enjoying this podcast, please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe. I do read all of the feedback and will be taking them under consideration in January as I do a massive reevaluation of all my projects. From the comments thus far, I'm thinking about doing solo video essays and then maybe trying to find a co-host for the podcast itself with less frequency for both because your girl has to really put her head down and work on her book next year. But I don't exactly know yet. Let me know what you guys think in the comments if that's like a good apportionment. And also, if you have any questions that you'd like me to address in next week's episode, which will just be a full Q&A, feel free to comment those below or send them to me via email at hello@ccshia.com. I'll also put up an Instagram story soliciting questions, so feel free to submit it then as well. And of course, special shout out this week to Basco Smiles, Shelly T, or I guess Shelly T, and Ray Ray Wah for leaving me such wonderful reviews this past week. I truly appreciate your taking the time to write a review, and I find myself quite astounded and over the moon with how thoughtful, both when it comes to positive feedback and constructive criticism, that the reviews have been. So really, really thank you. Okay, so for this episode, I'll go through all the stages of publishing from what you need to write in order to attract an agent, considerations for finding an agent, what the submission process for editors is like, and how to figure out which publisher is the best home for your book. I try to incorporate all of your questions into the summary, but had some leftover questions at the end that I'll just answer directly. So let's get into it. Like a lot of lawyers, I've always loved reading and writing, but I think the idea of writing a book seemed so foreign that I never really thought it was possible to do growing up. If you had asked me when I was in 5th grade how to go about writing a book, I would have had no idea. Nowadays, I guess everyone can Google it, and there are a lot of incredible resources online about the publishing process, which I'll link to in the show notes. But it was definitely not obvious how books got written or how writers became authors, at least not in the way that it was obvious to me that you went to college and then med school to become a doctor, or college and then law school to become a lawyer. And I think what was even more opaque to me was how writers made money, so I'll be sure to touch upon the financial aspect of writing a book as well. But first things first, we have to talk about the difference between trying to write a nonfiction book and a fiction book. My book is nonfiction, so I know a lot more about that world, but I did learn a little bit about writing fiction as well. If you want to write a fiction book, a lot of the work is done up front. You just have to write the book. Like, yes, the entire book. Not a sample chapter, not an outline, but the whole entire book. This is an incredibly daunting process to me, to be honest, because it evokes all of my core anxieties and fears. I don't do very well working by myself because I'm constantly scared that I'm doing something wrong, and I like having others around to gut check me or reassure me that I'm on the right track. And writing a novel is really all about working by yourself. Nonfiction, on the other hand, usually doesn't require writing the whole book ahead of time. Nonfiction books can be sold, quote unquote, on proposal, which means that the book sells based on a Word document that essentially functions as a pitch deck for the book. I sold my book on proposal, and I was really surprised by how much of a book proposal involved non-writing things like commercial viability, marketing plan, and how it fits in with existing books on the topic. In some sections of the proposal, I felt like I was doing a case for consulting interviews all over again. Estimate the market size for a book about law firms. Describe the marketing strategy for a book about law firms. How would you price out a book about law firms? Just kidding. The last one wasn't something I had to include in the proposal, but I did include the rest. I talked about my participation in bar associations, alumni groups, as well as my social media accounts and my creator and influencer friends whom I think would be willing to talk about my book in the future. There are some examples that you can find online about what book proposals can look like, and I learned through the process that proposals can look really, really different from each other. Like the book, you kind of have freedom to format it and structure it however you want. But at the bare minimum, a proposal usually includes sections about why you want to write the book, the market for the book, the marketing plan for the book, who you are, one or a few sample chapters, and a chapter-by-chapter synopsis to give agents and editors an overall idea of what the book will look like. I got one question about how much I wrote out to send to publishers. My overall proposal was 45 pages, single-spaced, and I also submitted a prologue and sample chapter, which took up like 18 of those 45 pages. But I've seen much longer and much shorter proposals as well. And to preempt the elephant in the room, yes, my social media following definitely impacted the attractiveness of my book. I think this is where novels and nonfiction books diverge in terms of what gets them published. If you write a novel, you don't necessarily have to have a quote unquote platform, which I've learned is publishing speak for an online following or some other type of authority, although a following never hurts. Nonfiction, I get the sense though that a platform is very attractive. I've spoken with other nonfiction authors whom I've met, and some of them have told me about getting rejected by agents and or publishers for not having a platform. One guy I spoke with was like, "Yeah, I basically got told over and over that I didn't have enough of a platform," which really meant that they were telling me to be more famous. I think this is why we see so many celebrities publish memoirs. They start their publishing journey with a huge boost, and even reality TV stars seem to be able to publish a memoir whenever they want to. This isn't to say that an online following is necessary to selling your nonfiction book, but given the nature of nonfiction books, some sort of authority, whether that be an academic position, an MFA, being a journalist, or other prominence in society, tends to be extremely helpful. Okay, so you have to create this baseline document for your book, right? For the novel, the entire manuscript, and for a nonfiction book, a proposal. This is the point at which you would normally start looking for an agent. The process of looking for an agent is called querying, where you send letters called query letters to agents asking them to represent you. The letters kind of seem like cover letters to me, and I saw several online communities and web pages devoted to this process of querying agents. From what I read online, it also seems like this process of trying to get an agent can be really tough. Your letter and manuscript or proposal will get left undelivered or read quite a bit. But all you need is one. I've been really trying to adapt to this new normal where there are a million more no's than there are yeses, but it's definitely challenging to prepare yourself for the onslaught of rejection that writing seems to entail. Now, I'm not the best person to actually speak on finding an agent because I found mine through connections, which, by the way, if you do think you have connections to agents or just anyone in publishing in general, such as editors, editorial assistants, or even PR or legal in publishing houses, whether through friends or former professors or whatever, you should totally take advantage of that. It's a lot easier to get your stuff looked at and to get a meeting when it's through a referral, and this is true outside of publishing as well. So don't die on this hill about meritocracy and your excellent writing carrying the day. When you're dealing with trying to capture people's limited attention, I wouldn't be shy about using your connections for referrals. It'll make this challenging process a little bit easier, and that's always a good thing. Like, you do not need to make your life harder when you don't need to, and it doesn't devalue your own work. You worked hard, and it's also unfair for other people who didn't have the same privilege of connections as you did. Both of those things can be true at once. I got a question about this for the Q&A episode, so I'll go more into detail about that next week because I think a lot of my fears about like, oh, if I'm a Democrat, then I'm devaluing my own work and effort, really played into why I was so attracted to libertarianism in the first place. But back to publishing. In general, when trying to decide which agents to query or if you have multiple agents offering to represent you, it's helpful to look at which authors they represent and what types of books those authors write. If you wrote a YA novel, it might be helpful to find an agent who represents a lot of YA authors. The industry is a lot about connections, surprise, surprise, so you want to find an agent that will have the right connections for your book. It's less helpful if your agent specializes in, say, historical nonfiction and you want to sell a high fantasy novel. Not saying it couldn't work because it totally could, but in the beginning, it can be helpful to try and filter for that. There's this website where book deals are published called Publishers Marketplace. You need a subscription, I think it's $25 a month, but you can pay for a month and just use that month to search for who represents some of your favorite authors or authors who write things similar to you, and then use that information to decide who to send query letters to. A few other authors also have blog posts talking about how they found their agent and how they went about that whole process, and I'll link those blogs below so you can take a look if you're curious. I also think that for agents in any field, podcasting, film, TV, what have you, and yes, the agent field is really that fragmented. The most important thing is talking to the agent and seeing if they share your vision for what you're trying to create. I hate reasoning that really boils down to vibes, but I do think vibes are necessary for a good writer-agent relationship, or any principal-agent relationship for that matter. They're going to be going out into the world representing you, so you want to make sure that their mode of representing you is similar to how you would want to be represented, you know? And if the agent doesn't know or understand what you're trying to do with your book, they won't be able to pitch it to the right people in their network. To that point, I've definitely met with managers and agents in the influencer sphere, at least who just didn't seem like a good fit for me. They were perfectly nice, really knowledgeable, but their vision of what I could get into were things like beauty ads, beauty events. And I do enjoy skincare and messing around with blush, but like, do I want to do more of that? Not really. So that's what I mean by ensuring that the agent that you decide on should understand your vision. You have to be in agreement about what the ultimate goal is and what the intermediary steps are that you should take to get there. This is an area that I really did just luck out with my agent in because I was pretty naive going into all of this and was just floored that anyone would want to work with me. And if my agent had been more demanding about what he wanted me to do, I probably would have been like, okay, like you know better than I do, and have done whatever he suggested, even if it may not have been what I actually wanted to do. But again, because I met him through a friend whom I trust, it just turned out that I could really trust him as well. In general, I've come to learn that it's better to have no representation at all rather than to be represented by people who don't like what you're creating or don't have the same vision for you about what the long term goal is. It sounds so trite, and a year ago, I probably would have cut off like an arm for an influencer manager, but now I'm pretty happy with the fact that I've just self managed this entire time because I never did meet someone who like got it in the way that I wanted them to, you know? Going back to last week's episode, I think for these types of relationships, it's really important that your agent or manager likes you for the same reasons that you want them to like you for. It's not going to end well if you want to be known for your wonderful recipes and your agent thinks that you'll be successful because you're hot and would look good in a cookbook's photos. You need an agent that also appreciates your recipes and what you want to do with a cookbook beyond the cookbook. So, after you sign with an agent, your agent will work with you on your manuscript or proposal. Just because they sign you doesn't mean that they think your manuscript or proposal is perfect. It just means that they see potential in your work. My agent went back and forth with me on my proposal for like 4.5 months, and it went under significant rewrites, probably 4 or 5 times. And my first draft was just so bad, so bad. Writing, like most things in life, is a practice, which just means that practicing over and over again is necessary to make it better. After you and your agent get the manuscript or proposal in a good enough place that your agent thinks they can send it to publishers, that's what they do. My agent handled all of that. After all, it is his job, and this is where a lot of the value of having an agent comes in. He has lists of publishers and specific editors at those publishers, and as the proposal comes together, he's editing his list of editors to send the proposal to and bringing up my book at meetings that he has with publishers to just kind of put it on their radar. If I ever thought of publishers or had publishers recommended to me by viewers or friends, I would also pass those along, but for the most part, I let him do his thing. The waiting period after the proposal or manuscript has been submitted to publishers is probably the most excruciating part. You just kind of wait and hope you get positive responses back, but you can't exactly ask your agent to like call every publisher every day to see if they've seen it yet because that's just a little too much. So I just waited for updates from my agent, and during this time, he also sent me some feedback from editors who had decided to pass on my book. This was probably the most challenging part emotionally because I basically just read rejection after rejection all in a row. It hurt even more because a lot of the feedback wasn't like, oh, your writing sucks, you should take a writing class, but more that they didn't see why anyone would care about the topic, which made me feel really alone. Like this project that I find really interesting and fascinating and want to devote the next few years of my life to, they just feel like it's like whatever. I guess I've always known that writers and artists can feel some sort of personal attachment to their work, but it wasn't until I got the rejections that I really did feel like the editors were stabbing me in the heart about this project that I deeply cared about. But of course, Nathaniel and my professor friend both reminded me that tons of rejections is just the nature of the beast, that you do just get 9 rejections per every 1 acceptance, and it's really the acceptances that matter in the long run. And that rejections always come before acceptances because it's quicker to say no to something than it is to review everything, get the proper approvals internally, and then respond. Which is exactly what happened next. I started getting interest from editors, and your agent will have all these strategies for how to manage interest and the timing of the whole process. And my agent started arranging meetings with like the interested editors. So we'd all get on Zoom, and it felt like a cross between an interview and a date. The editor will ask you questions about your book, maybe test out some of the questions that they have about how you might approach issues that haven't been ironed out yet. And you can also ask the editor about how they see the book taking shape. So you're both like kind of interrogating each other on doubts you may have about the publishing process. For example, I was aware of the fact that the publisher putting its promotional power behind a book seemed really important. So I'd ask them about like the publisher's capabilities for promoting and figuring out the best plan of attack for getting the book in front of people. And the editors often ask me about how I plan on ending the book because the proposal really only had the beginning written and a high level synopsis of the end, but like no real concrete ending yet. And while you're trying to get your doubts answered by the other party, you're also trying to put your best foot forward and see if you'd work well together, because writers do work with their editors a ton, and it's a long term relationship. I'm going to be working with my editor for the next 2.5 years, so it's crucial to ensure that you get along with your editor because your relationship with them will probably be longer than some of your past romantic relationships. I know that's true for me. Your agent also sits in on these meetings to facilitate things, which I found kind of funny because it made the whole thing seem like a chaperone date for an arranged marriage, right? Not that I've ever gone on such a date, but it's what I imagine an arranged marriage date might be like. So after these meetings with editors, your agent figures out how to formally receive offers from them. They'll run the process differently depending on how many editors are interested. For example, if just one, they might go to that editor and suggest that they make an offer that's attractive enough to take the book off the table for everyone else. This is called a preempt in the publisher's marketplace listings. If there is interest from several editors, the agent will likely run an auction, which is pretty much exactly what it sounds, except without the auctioneer's fast talking. My agent set a date for initial offers to be submitted to him, and we just kind of waited. And when that date rolled around, he called me to tell me that we had offers in and what the current status of the auction was. I didn't play a huge part in all of this except to tell him how I felt about the editors whom I had met. I really loved all of them, by the way, but if I hadn't clicked with one of them, my agent could have taken that under consideration when running the auction. But mostly, I just waited and got daily updates from him about the advance being offered and the terms of the offer until one day he called me to say that the auction was over and told me the final advance amount and terms. I got a question about whether writers have to pay any fees in order to get published or if writers get an advance, and it's definitely the latter in traditional publishing. If you're trying to publish traditionally, no reputable publisher would ever ask a writer for money in order to get published. Self publishing is a little different because the author does have to front the costs of publication themselves, but that isn't the case for traditional publishing. And when it comes to advances, the amounts can really vary. First-time authors generally get advances between 5,000 and 50,000, although there are so many factors in how publishers calculate advances that outliers always exist. And here's where having a platform, which can be an online following or some other way of influencing people to buy your book, can really help you obtain a larger advance than average. I found a good blog post from a literary agency on this topic, which I'll link to below in case you are curious and want to learn more. Another note about the advance is that it's not paid out all at once. So, say you get an advance of 50,000, but it actually means you'll get 12,500 upon contract signing, 12,500 when you deliver the manuscript, 12,500 when the book publishes, and then the last 12,500 at a date after publication. So that advance, that 50,000, is actually split up over 2 to 3 years, and this is one reason why it's actually really hard to make your entire living simply through writing. I know I've talked a lot about how I've always wanted to write, and I get this question a lot, but because of that, I don't regret pursuing law in the beginning of my career at all. I learned a lot from law school and legal practice, and I actually enjoyed learning for the first time in my life, which I think is a big deal. And I don't think I would have had the courage to pursue something as uncertain or risky as writing right out of college. And also, like, what would I have written about? College? I don't think that would have made for a good book, not because I don't think college is uninteresting. I think college is terribly interesting, but because I probably would have written an overwrought, overly florid recollection of college because I was still so insecure about so many things in life. Anywho, so after your book gets sold, you just write it if you haven't already. That's the stage where I'm at, and honestly, I'm both excited for it and so filled with imposter syndrome. Like, can I do this? I don't have an MFA. Do I need an MFA? What if my editor ends up hating everything I turn in? Do I, should I, oh God. Like, I have thought so much about getting an MFA before I even write, which is silly. But as you write the manuscript, or maybe the manuscript is already turned in because it's a novel, your editor will provide feedback and edits. The editing process is way less standardized than I would have thought. I actually asked my editor, like, so how does this writing and editing thing go? And she told me it's really up to me and her. Like, some authors like to have intermittent check ins with her and give her chapters to look at periodically, while others just drop off the whole thing when they're done. I'm definitely going to err on the side of checking in too much with her, I think, and giving her like a little bit too much to review, because, like I said, I hate working alone all the time and just wondering if I'm going in the wrong direction and continuing to go in the wrong direction. I also got a question about how I deal with edits that I don't agree with, and I haven't really gotten there yet because I haven't written much of the book yet. But I would hope that all of the talking with my editor ahead of time and her understanding my vision and proposal means that even if we don't initially agree on something, we'll come to an agreement. I hope I'm never in a situation where we just can't agree on something, because it will mean that communications have broken down somewhere. When the manuscript is formally submitted, that kickstarts about a year's worth of work on the publisher's side. This is where copy editing happens, fact checking, legal read of the manuscript to address any potential legal issues, all of that. Even the title of the book could change. So even though I pitched it with Big Bad Law as the title, the publisher might run some marketing tests and decide on another title. This is also where the book cover gets designed. I hope that I'll have some sort of input on what the cover looks like, but I've also heard some authors tell me that like their publisher was one day, hey, here you go, this is your cover. So it really depends on the publisher, I think. I'm pretty excited to see what the cover can be, and I also don't have any imaginations really for the cover right now. If y'all have any suggestions, maybe I can bring it to my publisher when the time comes. I think that would be fun. And then, as the book is getting finalized, a few months before publication, pre orders open for the book, and readers will also be able to get advanced reviewer copies of the book. This is where the author needs to figure out how to get people to read the book, review the book, otherwise promote the book so that when the book is released, people actually pick it up. To be honest, this is the part of the process that's freaking me out the most in the future, and I think probably will be the most challenging for me in the future. But I'm trying not to focus on it right now because I need to, you know, write the book first. But my brain loves thinking and stressing about the fifth step instead of the next step ahead for some reason. Okay, so that's the entire publishing process. I think I addressed a lot of the questions there, but I had a few that didn't fit in neatly, so I'll answer them now. First question is whether you need to be a good writer to get published, or if all you need is a good story. This is kind of tricky because I think they impact each other. Good writing makes a story better, but it's also entirely possible to have the good bones of a story, but perhaps not the clearest writing or something. I guess there's also an implicit judgment here, like, what is good writing anyway? I would argue that good writing is just writing that's clear. So if you can clearly write your story, which is a good story, then that's already good writing. But putting that aside, let's say you have a good story in your head, but not the clearest writing. I don't think this disqualifies you from publishing your book. The whole point of traditional publishing is that you will get a team, your editor, copy editors, and others who will help you with writing it and making it into the best writing possible. So, a good story, if you can communicate it somewhat clearly so that the publisher sees the potential in it, can totally get published. And if you really struggle with the clarity part, there's consultants and coaches you can hire to help you with the manuscript ahead of time, which may be worth a shot if you don't think you're communicating your awesome story clearly. Second question is, how do you find the right publisher? So, in addition to all the stuff I talked about with respect to vibing with your editor, I actually asked this question myself to one of the editors with whom I met, how they would think about picking where to publish. I really liked their answer, which was basically looking at the other books and authors that the publisher publishes and thinking to yourself whether you would want to be a part of that list. So, in some weird way, it's like viewing each imprint of a publisher as a club, or sorority, or fraternity, and seeing how you feel about being a part of that club. My imprint portfolio has published authors like Emily Chang, who wrote a book about sexism in Silicon Valley, and my editor has an author, Stephanie McNeil, who's publishing a book about Instagram influencers next year. And I just found those topics and books so fascinating, and therefore felt like I would be so proud to be listed among them in their books too. Next question is about the most challenging or difficult part of the process, which overlaps with another question I received, which was how I outline for the book. Because honestly, writing the book proposal has been the most challenging part of the process thus far. I haven't gone through the entire publishing process yet, But from what I have done so far, I would say that writing the proposal and outlining the book in the proposal before submitting it to publishers was the most challenging part. It was just so lonely, and I never knew if I was like revising something in the right direction, or even if I was crazy for just spending all this time working on something that might not garner any interest. It was honestly a pretty bad mental space to be in, full of self doubt that was only magnified by online comments criticizing me for having left my job. Writing is just really lonely, and I think loneliness tends to make it easier for your own demons to come out. I'm hoping that the writing for the actual book won't be as lonely because I'll have my editor, I'll hopefully make more writer friends who will be willing to trade drafts with me, and I'll be able to interview a ton of people for the book, which helps me feel less lonely. But who knows, we can do an update episode after I've turned in the manuscript and then after publication to check in. And for the outlining, because I had been thinking about this book for a while, I already had some chapters and themes in mind for how the book would go, like the constant availability expected, poor management, racism, sexism. So I just word vomited those themes and stories out onto a piece of paper and began rearranging them and putting sub themes within larger themes until I felt good about the sections. I think using paper that you can move around can be really helpful here, like a corkboard. I'll probably use this method as I write the full book as well, and I even bought this software, Scrivener, which would allow me to kind of outline and move things around as the manuscript develops. I will say that I've asked some writers and journalists about how they outline and organize research for their articles, and it seems really all over the place, like a huge trial and error that will depend on what works for you. Once I get a better handle on it, maybe I can make a YouTube video about what I landed on, but it's definitely a work in progress right now. And that is all for this week. I hope you enjoyed this episode and learned a little more about how the world works because that's honestly what I love the most, learning about how things in the world work and then sharing with all of y'all. If you enjoyed this podcast, please remember to rate, review, and subscribe, and send me your questions for next week's Q&A to hello@ccshia.com. I'll see you next time.